Hi everyone, thank you so much for inviting me to speak here today. And thank you to the Transplant Research Foundation for supporting our research project. And as previously mentioned, our project was a successful applicant from the Providence Healthcare Research Challenge from last year. So our research is still ongoing, but I'd love to present to you what we have so far. So my name is Wynne Chiu. I'm the team lead for our project, and my colleagues Erica Johansson and Kim Brownjohn is here today. We are the pre and post heart transplant patient and nurse educators in the Providence heart transplant program, and our clinical nurse specialist, Anne-Marie Khan, who is also the mentor for our program. So my interest in this topic started with a patient who I looked after in previous years. She had 2 previous kidney transplants, and from a series of misfortunate events, she ended up having to be on the heart transplant waitlist in combination with a 3rd kidney transplant. And because of all these previous transplants, she developed a lot of antibodies, so she was highly sensitized, which I'll talk about a little bit more in the upcoming slides. But she waited quite a while being on the transplant list, and as time progressed, she became more and more sick. And even though there were lots of conversations between the heart transplant, kidney transplant team with this patient, kind of offering her palliative care, maybe she wanted to be off the hook and live out the rest of her life comfortably, symptom-free, and not having to think about having to wait for a transplant. She wanted to wait, and she wanted to stay on the list. But despite her fighting very hard, it became clear that she was too sick and no longer safe for her to receive the transplant. So she came off the transplant list and shortly after succumbed to an infection. And my experience with working with this patient really got me thinking, how do these patients who wait quite a long time on the heart transplant wait list with these high level of antibodies, what their experience is and how we can potentially make it easier for them. So a little bit about these antibodies and why it complicates things for our transplant patients. Typically, antibodies are substances, proteins that are produced by our immune system, which is protective to fight off any foreign materials that enter our system. But in the case of transplantation, it adds a level of complexity when we have to match the donor to the patient. In Canada, the criteria for listing a patient, there's 4 statuses that we list a patient by. Status 1 being patients who are stable, waiting at home, to status 4, patients who are in critical care, life support, and waiting critically for a heart transplant. And in 2010, the Canadian Cardiac Transplant Network implemented this new status for patients specifically with high level of antibodies, because they recognize how patients with high level of antibodies, there's more difficulty finding them a donor. So when we put them in this 4S distinctions, S being the sensitization, it allows us to open up the search for their donors Canada-wide. And so these antibody levels are measured in terms of a percentage, and it loosely represents how likely we are able to find a patient's donor and the percentage of which we can find them a donor. So, for example, to qualify for the 4S distinction, having an antibody level of 80% means that the patient would have 80%, they would have antibodies to the 80% of the donor pool out there. So 20% loosely chance that we can find them a donor. So the higher the percentage, the more difficult it would be for us to find them a donor. So why would patients have high level of antibodies? So there's various ways patients would develop high antibodies, and it usually is as a result of times where their immune system would be activated. So, for example, if they have previous blood transfusions, infection requiring intravenous antibiotics, or moms who had babies where they develop antibodies to their own babies. Those are the most traditional ways where patients would develop high antibodies. But as medical technology advances, there's other reasons that are adding to this trend. So this testing of antibody levels itself, the testing method has become more sensitive and more specialized. So antibodies that are not picked up in the older techniques are now being picked up by the newer technologies. Patients who's lived through their first heart transplant and now coming to look into their second heart transplant, so that they're being retransplanted. these patients are also more likely going to have high level of antibodies. For kind of the same reason, the congenital heart patient groups, patients who are born with congenital heart problems, who've had now outlived or lived with their congenital heart disease into adulthood, and that's a growing population. These patients are now coming to us looking for to be on the heart transplant waitlist. And lastly, with the use of our mechanical heart pumps, the ventricular assist devices, these patients are also more likely to develop high levels of antibodies. So these growing trend in this growing group of patients, it's not specific to BC, not even Canada, but something that we actually will be seeing worldwide. And to kind of highlight the characteristics of this group of patients who have high level antibodies, I'm just pulling out this one research study that was published last year. And this group of researchers looked into the American database where they examined 4,000 patients between the year 2003 to 2006 to 2013, comparing and looking at the outcomes of patients with as their antibody levels go up. And as you can see here, this is what this graph kind of highlights comparing the group of patients with no or low antibody levels. I might need a drink of water. Sorry. Oh, sorry. Sorry about that. To the group of the high level of antibodies, so this would be the 4S group in Canada, they're more likely to be waiting longer for a heart transplant compared to the patients who have low levels of antibodies. They're more likely, they're less likely to receive a heart transplant, and they're more likely to be removed or might die while waiting for the heart transplant. And a little bit more about their wait time. Comparing to patients with no antibodies to the group of high level of antibodies, the 80 to 100%, you can see here, the higher their antibody level, the longer their wait time, and it's statistically significant. So these patients are in a predicament. They are waiting longer. They're likely sicker, and they probably had the reasons that made them have high level of antibodies. And the chances for us to look for a donor for them is that much slimmer than those patients who don't have high level of antibodies. So the objective of our study is to understand this group of patients. What are they going through when they're on the heart transplant waitlist and waiting that prolonged period of time? To get a sense of their experience, how they're coping, what they need, because their needs might be different than those of patients who have who don't wait as long, have low level of antibodies. And hopefully from the information that we derive from this qualitative study, that we can implement that into future policies and protocols and help patients in the future who are going to come to us and needing to be listed in that 4S distinction. As I mentioned, it's a qualitative study, so it's a series of guided interviews conducted by our research assistant. And from the information that the patient, or the interviews that the patient provide, we draw on our nursing knowledge using the interpretive description and to try to draw out information, patterns, and variations, and understanding how their experience might translate to future care situations. So the patients that we have approached so far, we have approached patients who are currently on the heart transplant waitlist under that 4S distinction, as well as patients who already received their heart transplants, but at the time of their transplant, they were listed as 4S distinction. So between the two groups, we have a total of 20 patients that we have approached. The research assistant, we've luckily found someone who was able to do the recruitment, and as well as performing the interview and dictating the interviews. So far, we've only had 3 patients agreed to participate in our study, and of the 20, unfortunately, 5 patients already turned it down, but we are still recruiting patients as we go. The interviews, although we thought it would be more close to an hour, has lasted a little bit shorter than expected, only 15 minutes. And the research assistant told us that of the 3 patients that he has interviewed, the 2 patients didn't actually feel like it was a big deal to be highly sensitized, which in itself is interesting. So be interesting as more patients participate, whether that's actually a trend. And the last patient that the research assistant interviewed, he had a tough time establishing rapport. So the final outcome, I kind of mentioned it through my talk, is really trying to understand the experience of these patients who are going to wait longer, who are probably the sicker group of the patients waiting on the heart transplant list, and trying to, from their experience, learn some new information that we can translate for patients in the future who are going to come through onto the heart transplant list. And also to maybe get some information that's relatable to other clinicians across Canada. And also to draw some focus on this 4S group, because as you see, the characteristics are quite different to that of other patients who are waiting on the transplant list. So ultimately, our team, or we feel strongly that we might not be able to change the fact that they have to wait a long time, but hopefully understanding how we can make the experience of waiting better could improve their time on the list. So that's